skylights, and they were all intact. And we were kind of in the edge of it, I guess, the house. And we had leaves. It ruined oh my iris were so pretty. They were just beginning to bloom. I had two really big ones blooming and a bunch more about to open. And I looked out this morning, and I think it got those that were blooming, and I don't know if it damaged the others too much or not. But it's that time of year. But I still can't tell him how I knew that was hail. But he wanted an explanation, and I don't know. I used to stand by my daddy every time a cloud came up, and he'd tell me. He knew. He could tell by looking at them. He knew what kind of clouds. He'd tell me the names of the clouds. And I guess that when I was little, I probably took every step he took as long as he let me, outside, and just as a toddler. So I know about clouds, but I can't tell you how I know, except that Daddy told me. But it wasn't but a few minutes after I told him that we ran into that hail. So it was worse here than it was out our place. We were just sort of on the edge, and I don't care to be in another hail. It's been a long time since I got caught out in a hailstorm. And if I had been driving alone, I would have already turned around and gone back home. But since I wasn't the pilot, we didn't take me too seriously until it hit. And so life is full of those kinds of surprises, isn't it? Just full of them. And I saw that I believe Ann Carthel posted that it got her skylights. That happened to me one day. Did yours? Do you have any this time?
No, we didn't have any damage in the skylights, but Brian and Mary did.
Brian and Mary did. Okay.
No, and so Jack came to patch it.
Yeah. Well, I came home from work one time, and there'd been not a cloud in the sky in Lubbock. And until I turned to go up in front of the house on that farm road, I began to see a little puddles, in the little depressions. And AC had just mowed the yard, and it had looked so pretty that morning when I left. Well, I got turned into the house, and there were leaves everywhere. And I still didn't think much about it, and I went in the house, and I knew we'd had hail, and there was a storm going. I could see in the east that it had passed over. And for some reason, I decided, when I saw how much there was lying on the ground, I decided I better go upstairs and check. I went upstairs. Well, there was a hailstone about the size of a baseball right there in the middle of my studio, and it had come through the skylight. So that's the only time we've had our skylights broken that I remember. But and forever after, it seems we had some leaking problems till finally they seemed to be fixed with the re-roofing. So I didn't see any damage from when I looked up there to the roof or anything. So I think we were just in the but it was enough to get those tender, beautiful iris. And that was the only thing blooming. But life is like that, just big surprises all the time. And sometimes they're good and sometimes they're not so good, but this was both good and bad. It hurt the irises, but it left other things intact, so I'm not complaining. But that was an experience. I think that's the first time we've ever, that I remember, and that's probably, it's probably happened before, but I don't remember it, to be caught out and not be able to get to shelter pretty quickly. So just would like not to repeat that, please. But there we go. Now today, we are going to come back to our stories of David, and if we have the time, we will do both lessons 8 and 9. We won't, if I can move on like I should, and I'm really going to retitle these lessons together, the two of them, and call them Truth or Consequences, Truth and Consequences, Truth and Consequences, because the Bible tells the truth about people. It doesn't it doesn't hide the bad parts as well as the good parts. The good parts are spoken of, but so are the failures. And, as human beings, we prefer that people not talk about the bad things we do, but focus just on the good things. But it doesn't quite work that way. We know that David's giving in to his lust and his affair with Bathsheba actually resulted in a plot that he devised to have the man murdered, her husband murdered, so that he wouldn't get caught. Well, of course, that was a foolish thing, and we are foolish. We do sometimes think that we can get by with things that we know better than doing. But in this case, David thought he had it worked out. Turned out not to be that way. What were the consequences? Let's just look that we already know about. Well, the very first one was the death of a son. I would say there's really an earlier one than that. I think it was the breaking of his easy relationship with the Lord. I think David had guilt that probably already bothered him. And then the death of this son was climactic in that early guilt about what he had done. I think he lost his peace of mind because he knew that he was doing wrong. Now, if he didn't know, the prophet Nathan was there to describe it to him, you remember, about him stealing the man who stole the vineyard. And then in today's lesson, we're going to see what happened to two other of his sons. These were sons of other wives. Amnon, who obsesses over his half-sister Tamar, and there was murder in the family as a result. And then we also have forgiveness and return to the Father's house. But it ends not well with insurrection against David himself by his son, one of his sons. So it's not something that to take lightly. We try to excuse ourselves sometimes, and we know God forgives, but God does not take away the consequences of our actions. They tend to come on down and accompany us. Now, in the course of time, we're going to be in 13th chapter first. We see the story, the consequence with these older sons that are from his other wives. And I want us to remember, I just said, I think I took every step my father took. Children observe their parents very closely. That's how they learn early on. And even though in a royal family, they are probably more separated from their parents, they still know. They still know what's happening, and they admire their parents, and they try to follow them. And in this time in particular, sons look to their fathers for learning. And sometimes, we don't always sit down and teach our children consciously, although I think I tried to, and I think that you probably did too. Sometimes we just simply are not as aware of how much they are learning from our everyday behaviors or their exposure to those behaviors. Now, in our culture, and I'm going to speak more specifically to our church culture, we question the moral and ethical standards of that day, of that time. We can't quite wrap our minds around the habits of royalty and their using women as sealing contracts among kings. It's all just really a real foreign concept to us. So it may be that to compare our behaviors with those behaviors makes us feel pretty good sometimes. But the truth is, they were people of that culture and of that time, and when they broke the rules of the culture, there was problem. Even though that culture may seem to us to have been rather loose in the way that they operated. The idea of multiple wives does not sit real well. Now we do still have people that practice that. In fact, on TV program, you can't get away from. In television, you can't get away from the stories of people who live differently. Let's put it mildly. There was a home and garden. You know, that's pretty safe. I use that to go, sometimes when I want to go to sleep, I watch it till I get drowsy. And this week there was a program with a man who had 4 wives. And they were trying to find a house that would be big enough to house all their children. And they couldn't decide on whether he needed a separate master bedroom and they'd visit his bedroom, or whether each of them needed a master bedroom, and each one was his with that particular wife. I mean, I'm sitting there thinking, oh my word, I don't know where they lived. You know, it was really strange to me in this day and time, but it does exist. So whatever the case, They did mention once that their children often got teased at school or bullied because of their unusual living arrangements. So there are consequences to pay for how you live, and particularly if it's outside the norm. But that is not really so much our issue as Christians as it is our tendency to choose culture over God's word at times. And even our culture has changed markedly since you and I were children. We would never have thought of anybody scheduling activities during the Sunday morning hour for children apart from the church. And today, parents don't seem to think anything about it, at least some of them. So culture does change. God loves us, and he loves each of us, but we still sin, and we come short of God's expectations. You can read that in Romans 3:23. And looking back at the problems that the patriarchs of the Bible experienced might help us understand how important it is that we live in such a way that God blesses and that we do not mislead our children. That doesn't mean they'll be perfect, because like us, they aren't perfect, but nevertheless, we need to keep it in mind. David, known as a man after God's own heart, in that 1 Samuel, verses 13 and 14, and again repeated in Acts 13:22, but yet he did a terrible sin against his friends and his family. His sin, his desire, his lust blinded him to the consequences of his behavior. So if we allow these desires to grow in our hearts, the consequences are not good. We do pay in this life, in a sense, for what happens. And sometimes we are affected by the consequences of the sins of others. You just can't get away from it. Sin is the way of the world. And I have good news. I've given you some bad news. I've got good news. I was reading on Facebook, and this was a report. So many articles have come out over the last, I'd say, 30 years about how the church is going down, 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 and Christianity is not represented. It's just at a stalemate. It's just getting smaller and smaller. Well, guess what? That's really not true. That is not true. And I had not thought it was true. What I think when they take these polls, what they're saying is the church is fading away in American culture or in world culture. It is not fading away. It is changing. And the churches that have decided to embrace the world's views over their Christian teachings are fading away. That's true. But there is still a vibrant movement of Christianity throughout the world, including here in our free society. People around the world are still dying for their faith. People are still living for their faith. And it's just that the face of it sometimes confuses us because things just don't stay the way they've always been, whatever it is, and that includes the church. And part of this has come out, I think, because of the debate over abortion. And I wonder, this, by the way, this article was a legitimate, it wasn't one of those somebody said things, it was a legitimate research and a legitimate study. And the world itself is changing. I've been reading all this week, all last week, and maybe this next week, Churchill's newest biography. And my goodness, we've come a long way from the attitudes of that day. And the world itself, the shape of the countries has really undergone massive change and continues to. So David is not the only person but that has ever encountered the challenges that to be faithful to God, that he did it better than most of us do it. And yet, even David, this man after God's heart, did wrong, and he is paying the consequences. And it's working itself out in the lives of his children and in his kingdom. And sometimes that hurts worse than the consequences, personal consequences that are immediate and to ourselves. Ammon. In the course of time, Amnon, son of David, fell in love with Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom, son of David. I think I would probably state that a bit differently. I wouldn't call that love. I think I would say fell in lust, because that is what the story bears out. Amnon became so obsessed with his sister Tamar that he made himself ill. Now that's lovesick, isn't it? She was a virgin, and it seemed impossible for him to do anything to her. Now, that's an interesting way to put it. Now, Amnon had an advisor named Jonadab, son of Shemiah, David's brother. That was his uncle, David's brother, one of David's brothers. His premeditated immorality was shockingly wicked, even in this culture of that time. It was pretty much the same way one of the pagan kings would and their families would have gone about getting their will. His brazen lie to his father showed how sin-sick that Amnon was. He was definitely not ready to be a ruler of Israel. What did he do? And I would like to know more about that brother, wouldn't you? I mean, that brother of David. Would you suppose there might be a little jealousy involved there? You know, David was the runt of the family after all, and he surpassed all his brothers. Here is what Amnon said to him. I'm in love with Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister. Now, she was a half-sister. And in this time, in this particular time, it was still legal to marry a half-sister. Now, later on, it became forbidden. But in this time, it was still possible. Go to bed and pretend to be ill, Jonadab said. When your father comes to see you, say to him, I would like my sister Tamar to come and give me something to eat. Let her prepare the food in my sight, so I may watch her, and then eat it from her hand. This is the plot. So Amnon lay down, pretended to be ill, and when the king came to see him, King David, his father, I would like my sister Tamar to come and make some special bread in my sight, so I may eat from her hand. Well, why wasn't David a little suspicious? Just what my question. David sent word to Tamar at the palace. Go to the house of your brother Amnon and prepare some food for him. So Tamar went to the house of her brother Amnon, who was lying down. She took some dough, kneaded it, made the bread in his sight, and baked it. Then she took the pan and served him the bread, but he refused to eat. And then this is probably, maybe women didn't have any rights then. She couldn't say, well, I can't imagine doing that for one of my brothers. I always said, get your own bread. That didn't mean I was always right either, but, some little alarm might have gone off here. But maybe she liked him too. She never dreamed what he was capable of doing. Send everyone out of here, Amnon said. So everyone left him. Then Amnon said to Tamar, bring the food here into my bedroom so I may eat from your hand. Well, Tamar took the bread and brought it to her brother in his bedroom. But when she took it to him to eat, what did he do? He grabbed her by the hand and said, come to bed with me, my sister. And then Tamar, he can't use the excuse that he didn't know any better, because she told him. She repeated to him, no, my brother, she said to him, don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing. What about me? Where could I get rid of my disgrace? And what about you? You would be like one of the wicked fools in Israel. Please speak to the king. He will not keep me from being married to you. She wasn't so dumb after all, was she? She knew the law, and she knew that her father would probably give Amnon what he wanted, and perhaps it was not that. It was the manner in which he approached her rather than that he approached her. So he pays her no attention, and he takes what he wants. And she says, let's see, lost my place. Oh, I got in the wrong chapter here. No wonder it didn't say what I thought it was going to. Anyway, she told him that there was no way he should do this, and he knew it. And then was it because she reminded him? This is just a terrible verse, this verse 14. But after she tells him he could request marriage, and then it would be okay. But he refused to listen to her, and since he was stronger than she, he raped her. Then Amnon hated her with intense hatred. Isn't that the way we are? If somebody tells us what we already know to be true, but we are going to violate that truth, don't we just hate them for reminding us and letting us know they know that we're wrong? We don't like to be told we're wrong, do we? But I just find that this is an awful story. And in fact, he hated her more than he loved her. than he had loved her. And he said to her, "Get up and get out." "No," she said to him, "sending me away would be a greater wrong than what you have already done to me." In other words, you've done this, now you're going to have to marry me. Well, he refused to listen, and he called his personal servants and had them throw her out and bolt the door. And so she didn't give up. She went out, and does this have the ring of something familiar? What's in the headlines today? Family violence, isn't it? Right there in the family, among the people who should be your protector. And so he sends her out, and she was wearing the kind of robe that a virgin daughter wears. And it was the kind of garment the daughters of the king wore. We don't know exactly what was special about them. But Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the ornate robe she was wearing. She put her hands on her head and went away, weeping aloud as she went. Her brother Absalom, now this is her full brother, I believe. Absalom said to her, "Has that Amnon, your brother, been with you?" He knew. A lot of people knew what Amnon wanted to do, didn't they? The close family knew there was a problem. What did they do to keep it from happening was my question, and it's the question today, too often. Be quiet. Be quiet. Isn't that the word people in families still get today when something like this happens in the family? Don't embarrass the family. And that's what society, that kind of attitude is what we still fight. Whether it's the boys or the girls, boys are sometimes the ones that are targets of abuse in the family today. And I'm sure that happened, that probably or may have happened in that day too. It's just abuse of power. Be quiet now, my sister. He is your brother. Don't take this thing to heart. And Tamar lived in her brother Absalom's house, a desolate woman. She was ruined. She could not be married, and he refused to marry her. Well, when King David heard all this, he was furious, and Absalom never said a word to Amnon, either good or bad. He hated Amnon because he had disgraced his sister Tamar. Well, the plot, of course, continues, and it's a tragedy. The silence in the family today is still a problem when these kinds of abuse of power. Oh, it's, they're not kings, but they are in a sense, they're the power over the children. But when these things happen, that is what the family does. It sees it as protecting the family. It happens in churches sometimes, and we're seeing that played out in the headlines too. And what is the membership's response often? Keep it quiet. Be silent. We don't have to be Catholic to have this happen. I know several stories, and I'm sure that I just know the tip of the iceberg. People do wrong wherever they are. They sin, just as David has done. The man after God's own heart, the man God loves, he's still infected with the sin that besets us all, and he is still responsible for resisting that temptation just as each of us is. David's anger was more general, it seems, than specific. He was angry that the event had happened. He didn't seem that disturbed about the daughter. He decided not to do anything about it. Maybe because Amnon was the eldest son and the heir apparent. He didn't want to mess up his career, his descendant. And then Tamar was the one who was punished because she was no longer eligible to be married into a royal family. She had been disgraced and forced to go into hiding in her brother's home. Now, Absalom's non-confrontational response later proved to be a ruse. He was waiting for his chance, and I suspect it didn't all have to do with the insult done to his sister. What have we talked about over the time as we read the Old Testament? It's very dangerous to be a member of the royal family because it was not unusual for fighting to break out among the children or anyone who was in the line of succession to the throne. And so we see in part of this that that too is a part of the story. So what does Absalom do? 2 years later, when Absalom's sheep shearers were at Baal Hazor, this is verse 23, near the border of Ephraim, he invited all the king's sons to come there. Absalom went to the king and said, "Your servant has had shearers come. Will the king and his attendants please join me?" And David says, "No, all of us should not go. We would only be a burden to you." A financial burden is what he's thinking. These are not children, by the way. They're not that young. Although Absalom urged him, he still refused to go, but gave him his blessing. That's kind of interesting, too, but then he had his reasons, and in this particular place, it would be too much of a financial burden. Then Absalom said, "If not, please let my brother Amnon come with us." The king asked him, "Why should he go with you?" But Absalom urged him, so he sent with him Amnon and the rest of the king's son. Now, David's no dummy. I suspect David knew that there was something going on, and it might not be something good that he would want to be attending. Absalom ordered his men, "Listen, when Amnon is in high spirits from drinking wine, and I say to you, strike Amnon down, then kill him. Don't be afraid. Haven't I given you this order? Be strong and brave." So Absalom's men did to Amnon what Absalom had ordered. Then all the sons got up and mounted their mules and fled. While they were on their way, the report came to David, "Absalom has struck down all the king's sons. Not one of them is left." Well, isn't that how it is when something terrible happens? The first word out, you really don't have the details correct usually. It's, we see it every week on the news. Something has just happened, and with our instant news now, the first reports are usually worse than subsequent reports. Maybe not. The only time I can remember very definitely not having exactly the correct report was when the two towers were hit. I just happened to be sick that day and sitting. I couldn't lie down. I couldn't sleep because I had that crud, that keeps you where you can't even lie down because you can't breathe. And so I was sitting up in front of my little TV in the bedroom in my chair trying to rest, and they moved to that first accident, the plane, which everybody thought was an accident, hit the tower. And then I was sitting there and I saw the second plane coming, and I knew as quickly as they knew. That's almost like being there. But even so, it took days to figure out exactly what happened. These incidents do. And it was the same then. The first reports, all the sons are dead. That was the report that went out. The king stood up, tore his clothes and lay down on the ground, and all his attendants stood by with their clothes torn. This is their grieving process. But Jonadab, son of Shemiah, David's brother, where have we heard him? Well, he was the originator of the plot, wasn't he? Said, "My lord should not think that if they killed all the princes, only Amnon is dead. This has been Absalom's express intention ever since the day Amnon raped his sister Tamar." Interesting. The brother of David has not only approved but inspired this action. Are we to believe David is going to be surprised? Somehow I don't think so. "My lord the king should not be concerned about the report that all the king's sons are dead. Only Amnon is dead." This is the time when the insurrection begins. Meanwhile, Absalom had fled. Now the man standing watch looked up and saw many people on the road west of him coming down the side of the hill. The watchman went and told the king, "I see men in the direction of Horonaim on the side of the hill." And then Jonadab said to the king, "See, the king's sons have come. It has happened just as your